If you have ever stood in a hallway holding a resignation letter in one hand and a photograph of your child in the other, you already understand the man at the center of this story. His name was Mason Cole, 34 years old, a former Navy SEAL with 2 combat deployments behind him and 1 small daughter who mattered more to him than every medal he had ever earned. What happened to Mason over the next 6 weeks would test everything he believed about walls, about trust, and about the terrifying possibility that the woman he worked for, a billionaire CEO with a reputation colder than the boardroom she ruled from, might actually be the safest place he had ever landed. Before we go any further, if stories about broken men finding unexpected grace move you the way they move me, hit that like button right now and subscribe to the channel, because this is a journey you will not want to miss a single minute of. And there is a twist near the end that changes everything you think you know about both of these people. Mason Cole had spent 11 years learning how to disappear. That was the job. After all, move without being seen, extract without being noticed, survive without leaving a trace. He had been good at it. Good enough that his old commanding officer used a joke that Mason could walk through a crowded room and nobody would remember his face 5 minutes later. But there was one thing 11 years of training had never prepared him for, and that was the sound of his daughter crying in the middle of the night because she missed a mother who was never coming back. Sophie was 6 years old when her mother, Rachel, decided that motherhood didn't fit the life she wanted anymore. She left on a Tuesday morning. No warning, no long goodbye, just a note on the kitchen counter and a suitcase gone from the closet. Mason had been home 8 months by then, discharged after his second knee surgery made further deployment impossible, trying to rebuild something that looked like a normal life. He remembered standing in that kitchen reading the note twice, then 3 times, waiting for the words to rearrange themselves into something that made sense. They never did. Sophie asked about her mother every day for the first month, then every week. Then, eventually, she stopped asking altogether, and that silence was somehow worse than all the questions combined. Money had never been the plan. Mason had savings, a small disability pension, and a stubborn refusal to accept charity from anyone, including his own parents. But savings run out, and disability pensions do not stretch to cover kindergarten tuition and swim lessons, and the orthodontist Sophie would eventually need. So when a buddy from his old unit mentioned that Vantage Dynamics, a sprawling tech and logistics conglomerate, was hiring former special operations personnel for executive protection work, Mason swallowed his pride and applied. 3 weeks later, he was standing in a glass-walled lobby on the 42nd floor, wearing the only suit he owned, waiting to be interviewed for a job protecting a woman he had never met and, if he was honest with himself, hoped he would never actually have to speak to. Her name was Elena Vasquez-Hart, and by the time Mason met her she had already become something of a legend in the business press. The youngest self-made CEO in the history of the Fortune 500, a woman who had taken her late father's failing manufacturing company and turned it into a $9 billion empire in under a decade. The magazines loved to print photographs of her in sharp tailored blazers, walking into shareholder meetings with an expression that dared anyone to underestimate her. What the magazines never printed, because they never bothered to look, was the exhaustion behind her eyes, or the fact that she hadn't taken a real vacation in 6 years, or that she ate dinner alone in her office at least 4 nights out of 7. Elena had inherited the company at 26, 3 months after her father's sudden heart attack, and inherited along with it a boardroom full of men twice her age who assumed she would fail within a year. She hadn't failed. She had outworked every single one of them. And in doing so, she had built a fortress around herself so complete that even her closest advisors sometimes forgot there was a person living inside it. She did not date. She did not attend galas for pleasure. She showed up. She smiled the smile the cameras expected, and she left the moment protocol allowed. Her security detail had turned over 4 times in 2 years, not because the men and women assigned to her were incompetent, but because Elena made it exhaustingly clear she wanted nothing from them beyond silence and distance. Mason's interview lasted 11 minutes. He answered every question directly, without embellishment, the way he had been trained to brief a mission. When the head of corporate security asked why he wanted the job, Mason said, "I have a daughter. I need steady hours and steady pay. I'm not interested in the glamour, ma'am. I'm interested in doing the work well and going home." That answer, more than anything on his resume, was what got him hired. Vantage Dynamics had learned the hard way that people chasing proximity to Elena's wealth or fame tended not to last, and tended not to be trustworthy. A tired single father who wanted nothing but a paycheck and predictable hours was, ironically, exactly what the position required. His first week on the job, Mason barely exchanged 20 words with Elena. He arrived before her, drove her to meetings, stood by doors, scanned rooms, and left the moment his shift ended. She treated him the way she treated the furniture. Necessary, present, invisible. He preferred it that way. He had built his own fortress over the past 2 years, brick by brick, and the last thing he wanted was entanglement with anyone, let alone a woman whose face appeared on magazine covers he sometimes saw at the grocery store checkout while buying macaroni and cheese for Sophie's dinner. The first crack in that arrangement happened on a Thursday evening in late September, 4 months into the job. Elena had a late board call that ran long, and by the time Mason drove her home the sky had gone completely dark and a hard rain was coming down sideways against the windshield. Halfway to her building, his phone buzzed on the seat beside him. He glanced at it out of habit, then again with more urgency when he saw it was Sophie's school calling at 8:30 at night. "Mr. Cole, this is Nurse Patterson from Lincoln Elementary. Sophie had an asthma attack during the evening aftercare program. We've given her the inhaler and she's stable, but I really think you should come get her as soon as you can." Mason's hands tightened on the wheel. Sophie's asthma had been under control for months, ever since they'd adjusted her medication, but a bad attack could still turn dangerous fast, and Mason knew from hard experience that stability could unravel in the space of a single bad breath. He said, "I'll be there in 20 minutes, and hung up, his jaw tight, already calculating routes and traffic, and how fast he could reasonably drive without losing control on wet asphalt. "Is everything all right?" Elena asked from the back seat. It was the first personal question she had ever asked him. "My daughter's school called. She had an asthma episode. I need to get her." He kept his voice level, professional, even as his stomach twisted into a knot. "I'll drop you at your building first, ma'am. It's only 6 minutes out of the way." "No," Elena said, and something in her tone made him glance at her in the rearview mirror. "Go get your daughter first. I can take a car service the rest of the way, or I can ride along, whichever is faster." Mason hesitated. Protocol was clear. The principal's safety came first, always, no deviations, no exceptions. But there was something in Elena's voice, some quality he hadn't heard from her before, that made him decide, against 11 years of training, to simply trust her. "Faster if you ride along," he said. "I don't want to waste time on a handoff." They drove to Lincoln Elementary in near silence, Mason's knuckles white on the wheel, Elena watching the rain streak sideways across the window. When they pulled up outside the aftercare building, Mason was out of the car before it had fully stopped, jogging through the downpour toward the entrance. He found Sophie sitting on a cot in the nurse's office, small and pale, her lips slightly blue-tinged, an oxygen mask loose around her neck where she'd pushed it down. The moment she saw her father, her face crumpled and she reached for him with both arms. "Daddy," she whispered, and Mason scooped her up like she weighed nothing at all, pressing her small body against his chest, feeling her ragged breathing against his neck, murmuring the same words he always murmured in moments like this. "You're okay, baby. Daddy's got you. Just breathe with me. In and out. That's it." He carried her out to the car that way, and it was only when he reached the vehicle that he remembered Elena was there, standing beside the open back door, rain soaking into her tailored coat. Holding an umbrella she must have found in the trunk, holding it not over her own head, but over Sophie's. "Back seat," Elena said quietly. "I'll sit up front. She needs to lie down." Mason didn't argue. He settled Sophie across the back seat, buckled the shoulder belt low across her hips the way the pediatrician had shown him for exactly this kind of situation, and climbed in to drive. Elena sat beside him in the passenger seat, soaked and silent, occasionally turning to check on Sophie, who had fallen into an exhausted half-sleep with her inhaler clutched in one small fist. At a red light, Elena finally spoke. "Does this happen often?" "Enough," Mason said. "Since her mother left. Stress makes it worse. The doctor says it's partly psychological, partly the humidity, partly genetics. Mostly it's just—" He stopped himself. He didn't talk about Rachel. He didn't talk about any of it. Not with co-workers, not with his own mother, not with anyone. "You don't have to finish that sentence," Elena said. "I wasn't trying to pry." "I know," Mason said, and he was surprised to find that he believed her. They drove the rest of the way to his apartment without speaking, but it was a different kind of silence than the one they'd shared for 4 months prior. Less like two strangers occupying the same space, more like two people who had, without meaning to, stepped over some invisible line and could not fully step back. When Mason carried Sophie inside, tucked her into bed, and came back out to the car to finally drive Elena to her building, she was standing outside in the rain again, having gotten out to wait for him rather than sit alone in the vehicle. "You didn't need to wait," Mason said. "I wanted to make sure she was all right before I let you worry about me," Elena said. And then, almost as an afterthought, quieter. "Thank you for letting me come." Mason didn't know what to say to that, so he said nothing and drove her home through streets slick with rain, and told himself the tightness in his chest was nothing more than leftover adrenaline from a bad night. That night marked the beginning of something neither of them named for weeks. Elena began asking about Sophie in small, careful ways. How her breathing was, whether the new medication was working, whether she liked her school. Mason began noticing things about Elena he had trained himself not to notice, like the fact that she rubbed her left temple when a call went badly, or that she always ordered the same simple pasta dish when she ate alone at her desk, or that despite the empire she commanded, she flinched slightly whenever anyone raised their voice near her. A flinch so small most people would have missed it entirely. Mason did not miss it. Reading people had kept him alive for over a decade, and he was reading Elena Vasquez's heart the way he had once read Hostile Terrain. Carefully, patiently, and with a growing, unwelcome sense that there was far more beneath the surface than the boardroom armor suggested. The trouble was, Mason recognized what was happening to him, and he hated it. He had built his life post-Rachel around a simple, unbreakable rule. No attachments beyond Sophie. Attachments were vulnerabilities. Attachments were how you ended up standing in a kitchen reading a goodbye note for the 3rd time, trying to make the words mean something different than they did. He had watched too many of his brothers in the service come home broken by people who promised to stay and then didn't, and he had promised himself, standing in that empty kitchen 2 years ago, that he would never again build his stability on a foundation that could simply choose to leave. Elena Vasquez's heart was, by every conceivable measure, the single most unstable foundation imaginable. A billionaire whose life was photographed, dissected, and gossiped about by strangers. A woman surrounded by people who wanted things from her. A woman who could, with one phone call, end his employment and vanish from his life entirely. Falling for her was not just inconvenient. It was reckless. It was the kind of tactical error that got people hurt. So Mason did what he had always done when a threat presented itself. He began, quietly and deliberately, to withdraw. He started requesting schedule changes that would put other members of the security team on Elena's evening shifts. He kept conversations strictly professional, clipped, efficient. He stopped meeting her eyes in the rearview mirror longer than necessary. Elena noticed. Of course she noticed. She noticed everything. It was the reason she'd survived a decade of boardroom warfare. But she said nothing, matching his withdrawal with a cool professionalism of her own. And if it hurt her, she buried it the way she buried everything, behind the practiced calm of a woman who had spent her whole adult life being underestimated and had learned never to let anyone see the cost of that. 3 weeks into Mason's retreat, he did something that surprised even himself. He submitted a formal request for reassignment, citing a preference for daytime static post work over principal protection detail. A request that, on paper, made no sense for a man with his qualifications, and everyone in the security office knew it. His supervisor, a gruff former Army Ranger named Diaz, called him into his office and asked him straight out what was going on. "Nothing's going on," Mason said. "I want different hours. That's it. You've had these hours for 5 months and never complained once," Diaz said. "Now suddenly you want out. That's not nothing, Cole. That's a man running from something." Diaz leaned back in his chair. "I've seen it before. You start caring about the principle more than the paycheck, and it scares the hell out of you. So you try to put distance between yourself and the problem." He held up a hand before Mason could protest. "I'm not judging you for it. I'm telling you that reassignment isn't going to fix what you're actually running from. It never does." Mason left that conversation angrier than he'd been in months, mostly because Diaz was right, and Mason knew it, and there was nothing more infuriating than being seen that clearly by someone who wasn't even trying that hard to look. The reassignment request sat on a desk for 2 weeks, unprocessed, while Elena's assistant scrambled to find coverage for an upcoming event that would require Mason's specific skill set. A black-tie charity gala hosted by Vantage Dynamics to benefit pediatric research hospitals across the country. An event with enough high-profile attendees and enough press coverage that Elena's security team needed someone with Mason's exact threat assessment experience. Someone who already knew her habits, her blind spots, her patterns. Diaz made the call himself. Mason would work the gala, and the reassignment could take effect the following week. One last night, and then Mason could disappear into whatever daytime post he thought would save him. Mason told himself it would be simple. Stand near the door. Scan the room. Get through 6 hours and go home to Sophie's babysitter, who would already be asleep on the couch by the time he got back, and put this whole complicated chapter behind him for good. He should have known better. 11 years in the field had taught him that the missions you thought would be simple were always the ones that changed everything. The gala was held in the grand ballroom of the Meridian Hotel. All crystal chandeliers and white orchids, and a 500-person guest list that included half the business press in the country. Mason arrived 3 hours early to walk the perimeter, check sight lines, coordinate with hotel security, and review the guest manifest for anyone flagged by corporate intelligence as a potential problem. Mostly disgruntled former employees and one persistent activist group protesting Vantage Dynamics manufacturing practices overseas. By the time guests began arriving, Mason had memorized every exit, every camera blind spot, every service corridor in the building, the way he had once memorized the terrain of hostile villages before a mission. Elena arrived at 7:15, and when Mason saw her step out of the car in a deep emerald gown, her dark hair swept back, an expression on her face that looked almost like nervousness rather than her usual controlled composure. Something in his chest tightened so hard it was almost painful. He forced himself into professional mode, scanning the crowd around the entrance instead of looking at her, escorting her through the lobby with exactly the correct distance, exactly the correct posture, exactly the correct nothing. The first 2 hours passed according to plan. Elena worked the room, shaking hands, making the small talk that raising $9 billion for research hospitals required, and Mason shadowed her at the professional distance the job demanded, watching hands, watching exits, watching everything except the way the emerald gown moved when she walked. It was during the cocktail hour, near the towering ice sculpture at the center of the room, that things began to go sideways. A man Mason didn't recognize from the guest manifest approached Elena with a confidence that read wrong from the first step. Too fast, too direct, his hand reaching for her elbow in a way that wasn't a greeting, it was a grab. Mason moved before conscious thought caught up with instinct, stepping between them in a single fluid motion, his body angled to block the contact without appearing aggressive to the surrounding cameras. "Sir, please give the CEO some space," Mason said, his voice low and even. The man's face flushed red. "Do you know who I am? I'm Grant Holloway. My family's investment group holds 4% of this company's stock, and I have every right to speak with." "You have every right to speak with her," Mason said, still calm, still blocking the physical space between them without ever raising his voice. "You don't have the right to put your hands on her. Take a step back, sir, and we can talk." Holloway's eyes flicked to Elena, clearly expecting her to intervene on his behalf, to smooth things over the way CEOs were supposed to smooth things over with major shareholders. Instead, Elena said, in a voice that could have frozen the ice sculpture beside them, "My head of security is correct. You grabbed my arm, Grant. That's not how business is conducted. Not with me. Not with anyone at this company. If you'd like to discuss your position in the fourth quarter, my office will schedule you an appointment during business hours." She turned away from him entirely, effectively ending the conversation, and reached out, not toward Mason exactly, but close enough that her fingers brushed the sleeve of his jacket, a small, almost invisible gesture of solidarity that no camera in the room caught, but that Mason felt like a current running up his arm. Holloway stalked off, muttering something about calling the board, and Elena exhaled slowly, some of the composure cracking at the edges. "Thank you," she said quietly, just to Mason, just for him. "That's the third time this year someone's decided grabbing me is an acceptable negotiating tactic." "It's never acceptable," Mason said. "Not once. Not ever." Elena looked at him then, really looked at him, in a way she hadn't in the 3 weeks since he'd started pulling away, and something passed between them that neither of them had words for. "You've been avoiding me," she said, not accusingly, just observing, the way she might observe a shift in quarterly numbers. "I put in for reassignment," Mason admitted, because lying to her felt suddenly impossible. "Effective next week." Elena's expression didn't change, but her voice, when it came, was quieter. "I see. It's not about the job," Mason said, and then stopped himself, because he had absolutely no intention of finishing that sentence in the middle of a 500-person gala with cameras everywhere and a job he desperately needed still technically on the line. Elena studied him for a long moment. Then, unexpectedly, she smiled. Not the practice smile she gave photographers, but something smaller and more real. "We'll finish this conversation later," she said, and walked back into the crowd before he could respond. It was nearly 9 o'clock when the MC took the stage to announce the evening's main charitable auction, and it was at that exact moment, as 500 guests turned their attention toward the stage, that Elena's assistant materialized at Mason's shoulder with a look of barely restrained panic. "We have a problem," she whispered. "The gala committee just realized Miss Vasquez Hart's official escort for tonight's press photos canceled an hour ago. Food poisoning, apparently. And there are photographers from 4 major outlets expecting a couple for the formal photo line in 10 minutes. The board is insistent the optics matter, especially with Holloway already stirring trouble about her distracted leadership. Whatever that means. She needs an escort for the photo line, right now, and there's nobody available." Mason felt his stomach drop. "That's not my department," he said carefully. "I'm security." "I know," the assistant said, already walking away to handle 6 other crises at once. "She's asking for you specifically. Says you clean up well enough." Her words, not mine. Mason stood there for a moment, feeling the peculiar vertigo of a man whose carefully constructed exit strategy had just been demolished by a single sentence. He found Elena near the edge of the stage, and before he could say a word, she stepped close, straightened his already straight tie with a small, deliberate motion, and said, quietly enough that only he could hear, I'm your date tonight, Mason Cole. Try not to look so terrified. It's just a photograph. Elena, Miss Vasquez-Hart. I'm your security detail, not your. Tonight you're both, she said, and there was something fierce underneath the calm. Something that told Mason this was not a request. I have 4 photographers waiting to prove to my board that I am not. In fact, some cold, distracted, unstable woman who can't hold a room without a security escort hovering awkwardly in the background. I need someone standing next to me in those photographs who I trust completely. And after tonight, after what happened with Holloway, I trust exactly one person in this entire ballroom. So, are you going to stand there arguing with me? Or are you going to walk me into that photo line? Mason looked at her. Really looked, the way he'd been trying not to for 3 weeks, and understood, with sudden and total clarity, that this was the moment his careful strategy of retreat had been built to prevent, and that it had failed completely, and that some part of him was almost relieved it had failed. Okay, he said quietly. Oh, I've got you. The photographs that ran in the business press the next morning showed Elena Vasquez-Hart in her emerald gown standing beside a tall, quiet man in a dark suit whose protective hand rested lightly at the small of her back. Both of them looking, for the first time in years of Elena's public photographs, entirely at ease. The captions speculated wildly. The board of directors, watching the headlines shift from distracted CEO to Vasquez-Hart's mystery man steals the gala, were, against all odds, delighted. But headlines were the least of what happened that night. After the photo line, after the auction raised $11 million for children's hospitals, after the crowd had begun to thin toward midnight, Elena found Mason on the hotel's rear terrace, where he'd stepped out to get air and to try, unsuccessfully, to process the last 3 hours of his life. "You're still planning to transfer," she said, joining him at the railing, looking out over the city lights rather than at him, giving him the space to answer honestly. "I don't know anymore," Mason admitted. "I put in for it because I thought," he exhaled, "I thought if I got some distance, I could stop feeling things I have no business feeling for my boss. Things that could get me fired, or worse, things that could get Sophie hurt if it all falls apart the way things always seem to fall apart." "You think I'd fire you for having feelings?" Elena asked. "I think you could fire me for a lot less than that," Mason said. "I think you're worth $9 billion and I drive a 12-year-old truck and pick my daughter up from asthma attacks. I think the whole world is watching every move you make, and the last thing you need is your head of security falling for you like some what?" Elena turned to face him fully now. "Some fool," Mason said quietly. "Because that's what it is, Elena. It's foolish. It's reckless. I promised myself 2 years ago that I would never again build anything on a foundation that could disappear on me. And you are the single most public, most scrutinized, most unstable foundation a man could possibly choose. And I have a 6-year-old daughter who has already lost one parent to somebody deciding they didn't want this life anymore. I can't risk that again. Not for her. Not for me." Elena was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke, her voice had lost its boardroom edge entirely, replaced by something raw and unguarded that Mason had never heard from her before. "Do you know what I do most nights, Mason? I eat dinner alone at my desk, because I've convinced myself that needing anyone is a weakness my father's company can't afford. I have not taken a real vacation since I was 26 years old. I have 400 employees who depend on decisions I make alone in an office at midnight, and not one single person in my life who has ever once asked me if I was tired, or scared, or lonely. Until 3 months ago, when a security guard with a daughter he'd walk through fire for started noticing when I rubbed my temple after a bad call." Her voice caught. "You call yourself an unstable investment. I call you the only steady thing that's happened to me in a decade. And I am not foolish enough to let that walk away from me over a job title." Mason stood very still, the way he had been trained to stand in moments when a single wrong move could unravel everything. "Elena," he said carefully, "if this doesn't work, if it falls apart, It's not just my heart on the line. It's Sophie's. She already watched one person leave without looking back. Then I won't leave without looking back, Elena said simply. I'm not asking you to trust the world, Mason. The world is chaotic and cruel, and it does not owe either of us anything. I'm asking you to trust me, and I understand completely if that's not enough tonight. But I needed you to know it before you walked away, and let a reassignment form make this decision for both of us. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then Mason reached out slowly, the way he might approach something fragile and important, and took her hand in his. Not the practiced, professional touch of a bodyguard steadying a principal, but something else entirely, something neither of them had a name for yet, but both of them recognized instantly. I withdraw the transfer request, he said quietly. First thing tomorrow. And tonight? Elena asked, something almost playful breaking through the vulnerability in her voice. Tonight, Mason said. I'm still your date. I intend to see it through properly. And when he leaned down and kissed her, gently, carefully, like a man handling something he had decided, after years of believing otherwise, was finally worth the risk. The city lights glittered below them, and neither of them thought once about cameras, or boards, or headlines, or anything at all except the simple, terrifying, wonderful fact that they had both, against every instinct built from years of getting hurt, chosen to stay. The weeks that followed were not without complications, because nothing worth having ever is. Grant Holloway, humiliated at the gala and furious about being publicly corrected by both Elena and her security detail, spent the better part of a month trying to stir up a boardroom revolt, whispering to other shareholders that Elena's judgment was compromised, that an office romance with hired help was exactly the kind of instability that made her unfit to lead. He nearly succeeded in forcing an emergency board vote, until Diaz, of all people, quietly produced security footage and incident reports proving that Holloway himself had a documented pattern of inappropriate conduct toward female executives across 3 separate companies, information that ended his campaign and his 4% stakes influence almost overnight. Sophie, for her part, met Elena for the first time on a rainy Saturday afternoon 3 weeks after the gala, in the cautious, careful way Mason had planned for weeks, expecting tears or confusion or the kind of anxious, clinging a child who'd already lost one parent might show toward a new adult entering her father's life. Instead, Sophie took one look at Elena sitting cross-legged on their living room floor, badly attempting to build a pillow fort under Sophie's very exacting supervision, and decided within 20 minutes that Elena was, in Sophie's own words, actually pretty good at forts for a grown-up. By the end of the afternoon, Elena had a crayon portrait of herself, Mason, and Sophie taped proudly to their refrigerator, and something in Mason's chest, some wall he'd spent 2 years reinforcing, finally, quietly, came down for good. It would be dishonest to say everything that followed was simple. Elena's world remained relentlessly public, and there were nights when the scrutiny wore on both of them. Headlines speculating about the relationship, photographers occasionally following Mason as he dropped Sophie at school. A strangeness to navigating a life split between boardrooms and PDA meetings. But they built, slowly and deliberately, the kind of trust that doesn't announce itself in grand gestures, but in 1,000 small ones. Elena leaving the office early enough to make Sophie's school recitals, Mason teaching Elena, on quiet Sunday mornings, the tactical breathing techniques he'd once used in combat to manage the panic that sometimes crept up on her during board crises. Elena quietly funding a wing of the very children's hospital that had once treated Sophie's asthma, not for publicity, but because she remembered, vividly, the sound of a father's voice telling his daughter to breathe. A year after that gala, standing in the same hotel ballroom for the following year's charity event, Mason watched Elena work the room with the same fierce competence she always had, except now, when she caught his eye across the crowd, she didn't just nod professionally. She smiled, the real one, the one she'd once reserved for empty offices and exhausted midnights, and crossed the room to stand beside him. taking his hand in front of 500 guests and every camera in the building, without a trace of the fear either of them had once carried into rooms like this one. "Any regrets, Mr. Cole?" she asked quietly, echoing, without quite meaning to, the question Diaz had once asked him in a cramped security office months before all of this began. "Only that I almost let a piece of paper talk me out of the best thing that ever happened to Sophie and me," Mason said. "Turns out the scariest missions are the ones you can't extract from. Good thing I stopped trying. If there is one truth this story leaves behind, it is this. The walls we build to protect ourselves from loss are rarely strong enough to keep out love. And they are never, ever strong enough to protect us from the deeper loss of a life spent alone by choice." Mason Cole spent 11 years learning to survive impossible missions by staying hidden, staying guarded, staying alone. It took one billionaire CEO, one rainy night, and one 6-year-old girl's crayon drawing to teach him that the bravest mission of his life wasn't the one he'd trained for in the military at all. It was the one where he finally let himself be found. And Elena Vasquez Hart, who had built an empire proving to the world she needed no one, learned that the strongest thing a powerful woman can do is not carry every burden alone, but to choose, deliberately and without apology, the people worth letting in. Somewhere in a modest apartment with a crayon portrait still taped to the refrigerator, a father, a daughter, and the woman who chose to stay are living proof that the family you build on purpose can be every bit as strong as the one you're born into. Sometimes stronger, because every single person in it chose, again and again, to remain.